Tasha Suri is one of the great fantasy authors of our time. I personally don't think she's as popular as she deserves to be. That's not to say she isn't. She is enormously successful, but there are still people who outshine her who don't deserve to. And I'm hoping that in some small way I can do my part with this video to get the word out on Tasha Suri just a little bit more. It was her novel The Jasmine Throne that first grabbed my attention. This is the first book in a trilogy, and I've talked before about the strange marketing around this book because it sits in a really weird place between epic fantasy and romantic fantasy. It kind of does both perfectly. There is a fantasy romance at the heart of this novel, but it's also a book with all of the political, social, and cultural complexities that you're likely to find in something like Game of Thrones or a Robin Hobb novel or Lord of the Rings. This is a wonderfully expansive work of epic fantasy, but it also has a beautiful romance at its core. And that romance is sapphic. Gorgeously, gorgeously sapphic. And this novel is wonderfully inspired by Indian history and folklore as well, adding a unique cultural take to the ever-broadening genre of fantasy fiction. And this is something that I've talked about before, something that I love to see, is that these days, fantasy, a genre that for so many decades was dominated by white men, is now a genre that is dominated by women of all different backgrounds. And Tasha Suri is one of the great ones. A brown British author who is imbuing her fiction not just with Indian culture and folklore, but also, as we'll get into with her newest novel, which is what I'm here to talk about, she's also someone who is incredibly politically savvy. Now, in the case of this book, her politics are very fantastical by nature because it's a fantasy novel. And so she is projecting so many things that we can sympathize with and relate to in an allegorical sense onto a completely made-up epic fantasy world space. You'll recognize themes of imperialism, patriarchy, etc., etc. You'll see it all here, but the setting is fantastical. And I do think that sometimes that gives the more naive corners of readership a free pass to ignore political allegory just by nature of reading something that is set in a fantasy world. And I mean, they can do what they want, but it is naive. Anyway, let's get to the book I actually want to talk about here. This is Tasha Suri's newest novel, and it is the single most beautiful work of modern fantasy I have ever read. And I'm picking the word beautiful here very intentionally because a lot of fiction is beautiful in its own way, but the beauty here is pretty spellbinding, and I'm going to go into a lot of different ways in which this book is, in my opinion, beautiful. This is The Isle in the Silver Sea, and unlike The Jasmine Throne, this book has been fully marketed as a romantic fantasy novel. Obviously, when I first heard about this book, the first thing I saw was the title, and I assumed it would be set on an island, some fairy tale fantasy island, and I was wrong. I mean, it is an island, but this isn't just a work of fantasy. It's historical fantasy. The island in this book is Britain, England, Wales, and Scotland. Not only that, but it's actually inverted. The island is facing the wrong way. This is a strange, magical, alternate history of Britain. And it's important to know that this is Britain, because I said before that certain fans of fantasy can choose to ignore political allegories. But you can't do that when something is as on the nose as this is. Tasha Suri is not just an author of beautiful romantic fantasy fiction, but she's also someone who explores politics in a very palpable and thought-provoking and unique way. I'm so excited to talk about this book. Now, while no particular time period is set in stone here, The Isle in the Silver Sea is very obviously set in a kind of early industrial period of British history. You can see that in things like gunpowder, factories, etc. And in this novel, we have two main protagonists, a witch and a knight, both of whom are women and both of whom are fated to fall in love with the other. Our witch is a woman named Simran, and her knight is Veena. Both Simran and Veena are what we call elsewhere people. In this version of Britain, an elsewhere person is a foreigner, someone who very obviously has heritage outside of white British culture. That is one small difference that sets this world apart from our own. Another one is the big focus on stories, tales, folklore. In this version of Britain, stories are alive. They are things that have a kind of metaphysical and literally physical power over the landscape itself, over history, over culture, over ecosystems. Stories are told and retold, but not just in writing or verbally, but they are physically lived out. And Simran and Veena are part of one of those stories. Simran and Veena are incarnates, reincarnations of people who have time and again lived through their story before. Countless times over the centuries, there have been knights and witches. And in each reincarnation, the story is told again, where a knight falls in love with a witch and eventually is fated to kill her. It has happened so many times, and it is fated to happen again. And they're not the only ones. These incarnates exist everywhere, all around Britain, and their stories are tied to the land. If an incarnate dies, not in the way they are fated to, their story dies. And when their story dies, a part of Britain dies. Literally is wiped off the map, wiped out of the memories of people as if it never existed at all. Now, these stories, as we learn, do kind of evolve over time, very, very subtly. But what is remarkably different here is that the knight, for the first time ever, is a woman. And not only that, but both of them are elsewhere people. They are not white Brits. And to make things more complicated, there is someone out there right now killing incarnates. Stories are dying, and parts of the Isle are dying with them, because that is the consequence. Now, before I get into the politics and how frighteningly clever this novel is, I need to emphasize, as I said at the beginning, the beauty of it. And the beauty begins with the writing. There is a playfulness, but also a hefty and respectful level of nuance given to the characters, their journey, their interactions, their dialogue, etc. Tasha Suri is a poet who, instead of writing poetry, writes fantasy novels. She picks her language so carefully and so artfully to depict not just beautiful scenes painted into the imaginations of the reader, but also she paints such beautiful characters and the ways that they move and talk. The way that everything is described is breathtaking. And as a huge fan of Gothic fiction, it does bring to mind the great classic Gothic novels of old, especially something like The Picture of Dorian Gray. Not many modern authors, especially within the world of fantasy, are so focused on the quality of their writing. So many fantasy novelists churn out decent stories that succeed in spite of their writing. Think about all of the biggest names in fantasy. Brandon Sanderson, George R. R. Martin, even women authors that I so admire for their ferocity and their great storytelling and character writing, like N.K. Jemisin, Robin Hobb, Susanna Clarke, Sarah El-Arifi, Hannah Kaner, R.F. Kuang. All of these authors write beautiful stories, but they do not write with beauty in their words. I mean, sometimes, you'll be captivated by something, but not like with Tasha Suri. There is a true poetry to her writing, where the craft itself is as gorgeous as what is created through that craft. And I so admire it. The love and attention that is poured into every word and how those words come together, it really sometimes feels like a dying craft. I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I don't want to say kids these days or the world is changing and I don't like it, but just by dint of the amount of fiction that exists out there and how publishing is always growing, it does feel like we have fewer authors who truly appreciate the craft of putting words together and the beauty that comes from just the words themselves, never mind the story that the words create. And I am so impressed by that beauty. Tasha Suri writes beautifully. And if I compare her to Oscar Wilde, it might sound a little bit dramatic, a little bit hyperbolic, but compared to every other fantasy author I can think of, even the ones I admire above anyone else, it's not hyperbolic. She stands closer to someone like Oscar Wilde than any other fantasy author does. And I am a diehard fantasy fan saying that. And the other reason that this is such a gorgeous work of fantasy, why this is beautiful, is the fact that it is a fairy tale. It uses so many of the tropes of fairy tale and fantasy writing to create a very rich, vibrant, and colourful world. Yes, this is a very sharp political takedown of colonialist British history, and we'll get there, but it's also a fairy tale. It's also a beautiful love story. And there is so much beauty in the connection and the relationship between this knight and this witch. These two women, the way that they walk and talk and feel and look and sound, it's all communicated so well that you feel as though you're walking through this cartoon landscape, this beautifully animated thing. I had such vivid images swirling around in my mind as I was reading this book. These characters breathe beauty, even the ones that are awful, even the darkness, the mystery, the death, the tragedy that exists here. It all feels very Shakespearean. It all feels so dramatic in its cartoonish fairy tale nature. There is a real dramatic flair to the fated demise of these characters. Tasha Suri knows what she's doing here in writing something that feels fairy tale, that feels Shakespearean, that feels traditionally fantastical in an almost Arthurian way. And yet, as we're going to get to now, she's also writing something that is so beautifully politically wise. Right from the moment that I talked about how the repeated stories of this book that play out through literal reincarnation and how those stories are connected to the landscape of the British Isle itself, how that is all a political allegory. What exactly Tasha Suri is saying just through that. The idea that traditions can be so poisonous, that the obsession with tradition can lead to so much danger and toxicity, can lead to so much racism and xenophobia and other bigoted attitudes. People take their traditions and their stories so to heart as to exclude other people. I'm sure you see so much uproar every single time some kind of work of fiction, some IP, some story that's been around for a while, like Star Wars or Superman, when one of those things is made woke, when for some reason Thor is a woman now, or there's a black person in Star Wars, the uproar is insane, because these things are tradition to people. And when I say people, I specifically mean, anyone. Superman is a tradition of mine. I've grown up with Superman. He's one of my favourite characters. But to the people who latch onto these things and are also racist, xenophobic, homophobic, various other things, to those people, the tradition of keeping a character white or a wild white, it is so integral to their relationship to their land, to their fiction, to themselves, and it's really disturbing. And this book is poking fun at that, but it goes deeper than just Star Wars fans get upset that there's a black guy in there. I'm just using that to kind of ground you and give you a kind of frame for this, if you like, but this is a bigger story than that. This is a book about Britain specifically, about British culture, British history, British traditions, and British folklore, narrative histories, narrative traditions, and how those things are so tied up to things like Christianity, how our stories are tied to our landscape, to our ecosystem, to the social elements of how we spend our days, things like a Sunday roast or whatever. Tasha Suri is exploring the relationships between narratives and tradition and white British culture, or lack thereof. Beyond that, there is also a really key thing that is so clever that you see right from the beginning, which is that at the start of each chapter, for about a page, half a page, whatever, you get a little snippet of text. It's usually a quote from a story, a letter, an essay, a speech, something that someone has said or written, and it has been logged away by this government group, this very important agency that the knights actually work for. And in the book, these people actually determine whether or not a story can be kept, a story can be put out for public consumption, or if it's something that needs to be checked over, edited, burned, whatever. This group that are part of the government are called the archivists. And they decide what stories are suitable, what stories can exist and what ones can't, and why. Well, maybe not why. It's just whether or not it aligns with their narrative, the British narrative. For example, the very first thing that we read at the beginning of chapter 1 is this. This is how it begins. Long ago, a story was told, and land grew from it. Tell a tale of wolves and a girl in blood red, and somewhere a forest will grow. Sharp-toothed and open-mawed for a foolish wolf's bones. Talk of monsters slithering through the darkness, and somewhere there will be caverns to hold them. Speak a thing and make it live, on the land across the silver sea. That is a mortal gift. But those stories are hungry, and they must continue to be fed. Tell me, whisper the stories, repeat me, enact me, embody me, and so we feed them, one child at a time. Source, a monograph on the laws of the Isle by Dr. Angharad Walsh, unpublished. Archivists' ruling, destroy. Publication barred, interrogation recommended. So this piece of writing by the fictional Dr. Angharad Walsh, which lays out so much of the thesis and themes of this novel, is a piece of writing that the archivists in the Queen's government deem dangerous, something that must be destroyed, and something so dangerous that the author of it needs to be interrogated. This is a very dystopian world in that way, and it is a world that is increasingly recognizable. A world similar to that of 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale, where everything is controlled, narratives are controlled. But not only that, in this fantasy world, those narratives actually do physically affect the landscape. This is a novel that takes the threat to the freedoms of information, the themes of control of the flow of information, and puts it all into a fairy tale fantasy romance. It's a very daring thing to do, but Tasha Suri can do it. She does do it. She proves it with this absolute beautiful masterpiece of a novel. And these things only get more interesting and expansive as the book goes on. We hear pieces of writing or snippets from speeches and essays written by elsewhere-born people or about elsewhere-born people. And if they fit the narrative of white British tradition and culture, they get to be kept, archived, maybe even put out for the public to read and spread. Otherwise, they might be kept for editing purposes or otherwise destroyed altogether, as this first one was. The Isle in the Silver Sea is very much a story about stories and storytelling. The power of stories, the power of narratives, and what traditions are passed down and why. There are so many stories out there all across the world that have been snipped, buried, controlled by the governing bodies that decide on what narratives should be put out there. Years and years ago, I was visiting my parents and I was sitting around the table with my dad, and we got into a conversation about the British Empire and colonialism, and I remember saying the phrase, "Look at what we did to India," and my dad sort of coughed and went, "I think you mean what we did for India?" And right there, that is a throwaway example of narratives and perspectives. An example of what you grow up believing or just what you grow up hearing. And I think what you grow up hearing is so important. That's what this book is at least partly about. Controlling narratives and making sure that the right people's stories are maintained and spread, and the wrong people's stories are buried, burned, ignored, diminished. Cultures are wiped out. The British Empire spreads its whiteness, its Christianity, its traditions, its goodness by its own measure. It not only wipes out the stories of the people it comes in contact with, but makes sure that those stories can't get back to us. The British Empire historically has used, by force, the labour of black, brown, indigenous people without allowing the culture of those places to have any effect on our culture. Of course, they have, but not half as much as could have happened if the narrative wasn't being controlled. And you don't even have to go beyond our borders to see that. Look up what the Welsh knot is. I don't have time to get into that. Look up the Welsh knot. Read Translations by Brian Friel. It's a wonderful play. Look up the fact that the Irish potato famine wasn't a famine. Read about these things, and you can see what this book is getting at, how narratives are controlled. The Welsh language, the Gaelic language here in Scotland, these things are endangered and have been endangered for a long time because of white Britishness, because of Englishness. And again, that's what this book is driving at, but it goes beyond the island as well. Our protagonists, as I said, are a pair of brown lesbians who come from somewhere else, and yet are telling a white British story through their physical existence, their incarnation on this island. They are part of a legacy, a cycle of fate, a doomed one, and a very beautiful one. I could go on and on and on, but read it and you'll see the beauty of the politics, the beauty of the writing, and the beauty of the characters. The ode to fairy tales, but also the way in which the book is so critical of traditions and stories and how those things are inherently racist, xenophobic, exclusionary, homophobic, etc., etc. The Isle in the Silver Sea is, for so many reasons, one of the most beautiful novels I have ever read, and I can't wait for you to read it, to fall in love with it, and to appreciate it the way I did. If you already have, tell me what you thought in the comments. I really hope that this book gets all of the love and attention it deserves. It's one of the best books of 2025, especially within the genre of not just romantic fantasy, but of fantasy full stop. It is a masterpiece. Check it out and subscribe for books.